So we are talking about the prospect of or advantage of introducing IIT over and over again, but from a different level of the explanation, right? Like a very high level intuitive understanding to more precise, but with lots of jargons. And you feel like both of them needs to be done.
Yes, I learned the most by actually using it. So learning by doing. That was the most helpful for me. And I'm basically going back and then seeing what the jargon meant. So running the code, understanding what it does, and then seeing, so your paper was very helpful. I think it's the first figure in the young adult paper where you have the whole stream that you have to go through with your data. And then you explain, this is the CES. And so then all of a sudden it clicked. And so, and then once I understood the jargon, and then to go back to the original papers, lots of ahas, a lot of it opened up more.
Yeah.
But what you just said, I think it's important as well. I also had the experience that I did the opposite. So I gave a talk that was purely about how to use transition probability matrices and do the marginalizing and all that. And at the end, the criticism that I got was that, well, this seems like a bunch of analysis without any theory. And so that was heartbreaking to hear, because the opposite is true, right? The exciting part about IIT is that it comes from this taking that very, well, the starting point of IIT is one that we all should agree to, because it's basically going so deep down in theory. But I think that's why it's hard to combine all of these things. It is a very theoretical theory, but it's also very hands down, and you can run things. You can do them.
Yeah, I'll take the note on mind map. Like this way. So multiple iterations.
Yes.
What's effective to learn, and also what failed. Right, that's what you are kind of talking.
That's right.
And so doing is most important. And I also totally agree with this, because even I really, when I started learning IIT, it was really around 2010 when Masafumi and I started to collaborate on IIT. And it was Masafumi who said that, this is something, this part of IIT is something that I think I can improve on. And then I was like, until then, I was interested, and I read 2004 paper, version 1, and 2008 and 2009 paper very quickly. Found really interesting, but I thought that it's impossible to understand, and so it's impossible to do anything like, concrete. Then 2010, I think it was already the time that the first approximation by Anil Seth and Adam Barrett was up, and Masafumi, read that approximation paper, and then went back and forth between 2008 paper, and then identified some kind of program, and then from then I gradually built on my understanding of even information theory. I kind of knew that, but unless you do it, right, you really don't gain some kind of intuition. And I also started to recently realize all of this actually for both category theory and also quantum cognition. And both of them, unless you do that, you feel like you understand something, that is written and then also interesting, but you just can't do anything by yourself, right? Yeah, so that's what I was thinking. And also, next thing that I also found quite useful these days for both, category theory and the quantum cognition success is that reviewing the material, which I completely stopped doing after I graduated from high school. But from the memory research in neuroscience, it's obviously important to review things, right? And what I have been doing as a sort of professional, as I became professional or graduate student, is that I'm always highlighting things that I thought important. But highlighting is also proven not to be effective in memorizing or in understanding things. But understanding or memorizing the jargons do require review, I think. And I think natural way I started to kind of learn or memorize this is that the doing is actually a form of the reviewing, right? Because you do that 2 days after or 2 weeks after or 2 months later, by revising the manuscript. I now do automatically all this reviewing. But once you just read the paper, that's it. It's completely gone. So I think reviewing is useful to do, especially for these IIT and other mathematical kind of stuff.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that that's maybe related is interactions. So, and I think again, it goes back to the jargon as well. If you talk to other people and you're using the same language, then you see where you're not being precise, and it just again digs deeper in your mind as well. So I think that for me, again, your YouTube channel, starting with the tutorial that you have on there about how to compute phi using PyPhi, like that is, I remember when I watched this for the first time, it was an epiphany going off all of a sudden, understanding that, oh, this can be used now using neural data. This is, so maybe with what failed, the one thing that, because you alluded that too, and I found it interesting, is that initially when I heard about IIT many years ago, and you said the same thing, it seemed that, oh, but you would have to know all the neurons in the brain and all simultaneously to really get to max phi or to compute the CES. But the step that the realizing that you don't have to do that you can get started smaller, but not just using robots or small logic gates, networks, but you can also start using it on your data. That is really, I thought, what was revolutionary, which I think will open the door. So that the Leong et al. Paper, that's why I think it's revolutionary, and I mentioned it in all my talks. I taught on IIT in a graduate seminar, and it was the same thing that once that figure that you prepared in doing it all was discussed, one student presented it to the other students, there was smiles going on and clapping going on, because everybody felt that finally I understood, finally I get it. So it really helps to have like that real world data. And in our case, we know these data, we understand what spikes are, right? And then to like walk that through and understand that.
So you're doing that for the undergraduate or graduate student?
Graduate level. Yeah.
That's quite good. I mean, so this year I've been also teaching neural-based consciousness, and this year I broke down the each of the video into roughly like 6 to 10 minutes, so it's probably much easier to understand. But hopefully, some of the IIT basics over there would be also useful, and also the book that I wrote in Japanese. Now I'm trying to also translate it to English. That also has a different way to present IIT in a intuitive way. So hopefully that different numbers of the encounter and the different opportunity. Suddenly, I hope people to understand it.
And with category theory, somebody in your lab posted a couple of links that I thought was really helpful. And a long time ago, you posted a YouTube video that helped me as well. But there I'm stuck because I'm not using it. So I feel that I know the least about. And then with quantum cognition, it's the same thing again, that I only started getting interested in the, Hilbert spaces and using the formalism that is used in quantum mechanics, when I got interested in quantum computing and realized that there's no way around it. You have to learn that in order to program a quantum machine. And so it's the same thing, learning by doing in a way. And then you realize that how powerful it is to apply it to other things as well.
But do you talk with Jennifer Trubrod?
Yeah, she was actually in one of the talks that I gave on IIT, and I talked about how that relates to her work. Okay. And we had a email communication afterward, and yeah, hopefully more will come of that. So yeah. Yeah.
So the reason why I'm very interested in her is that as you know, we've been thinking about to characterize a query structure. One way to think about that is to get the empirical data is a similarity rating between different kind of qualia, like color, right? And then see if that kind of relationship is also found in the level of the information structure or IIT mix and things like that. And then let's say if the red and orange looks perceptually similar, then that person's IIT structure related to red and orange should look similar. And if it's not, then IIT is dead, right? So that's a kind of idea. And then we've been doing this, a similarity experiment. And then the more you get into this similarity literature, you notice that many of the similarity literature actually assumes a lot of things that are really unclear whether it's true or not. And one of the things is the symmetry. So when you think about, because this is very relevant to this, IIT and also, query structure, let me elaborate on it, right? So most of the people's intuition about the query, I think, is that it's a point in one high dimensional structure, right? Space, high dimensional space.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was something that I also kind of, got from the recent review by Andrew Lee, 2002 paper. And there he calls it as a standard model of a query structure or a query space. But then if you assume that, query or anything that we experience can be represented as a point in high dimensional space, then it immediately says, three things. That is, first, identity or minimality condition, which is that the distance between one point to the another is 0, only if that point is the same as that point.
Yeah.
The second is that symmetry. One point to the other, similarity has to be the same as the other to the original. Distance of AB has to be distance of BA.
Yeah.
And the third one is called triangle inequality. A to C has to be always minimum compared to A to B to C, right? These three things are so-called metric space assumption or axiom. Actually, it's like an IIT axiom, right? And then if you assume that, empirically, none of them is true, actually, in many cases, right? The minimality violation is kind of quite interesting, and we are writing a paper, but even if you present the same thing twice, which has to be in the different space or different time, it doesn't look the same always, right? And people almost always consider that's just a failure of the mechanism, like noise. But what does it mean? I don't really understand it, right? Then the second one about symmetry. This is much more kind of tangible. If I ask, this is also one of the paper from Jennifer's, but do you think China is similar to North Korea? Then you would say probably no. But if I say, is North Korea similar to China? Then you would say, yeah, yes. And in fact, we've been doing experiment on the color patch, and then finding that probably this is going to be statistically really true, that pale blue is pale blue similar to really focal blue versus focal blue similar to pale blue. It's different.
Wow.
And the so far ad hoc explanation is that it's an adaptation or something like that, right? But adaptation priming kind of explanation is I really hate it actually all the way in my life actually, because why do you say in one case adaptation and another case priming? Is there any sort of coherent theoretical explanation, right?
Right.
It's always ad hoc to me. And
yeah.
Quantum cognition is very interesting in this sense. My favorite paper is a Possel's paper, Possel's Trubrad and Buzemeyer. But that basically says, using quantum model, which is different from the standard model in thinking one state or one qualia as one subspace, which is kind of, again, the jargon, right? that you need to learn and there's a memorize subspace among this, vector space. Unlike point in the high dimensional space, that solves many problems. And if you think about it, thinking about one moment of experience as one subspace, which means that it has some kind of structure and so states, and then you want to measure that, and then you project on one kind of axis, which is called another subspace, and then you get an answer. But after asking some kind of question, the state itself changes. And this is really akin to phenomenal access kind of debate, isn't it?
Interesting, yeah.
Right? You have your conscious states, but it's not like a point. It's much better to think about it as a state in a Hilbert space. Yeah, as you know. And then the only way we can measure it is to do some kind of measurement that disrupts the original state. Right?
Interesting.
And then, depending on the way you measure, if it's completely orthogonal, then it doesn't interfere. But if it interferes, like I suggested, pale blue, then focal blue kind of thing, that has a systematic and also lawful kind of reason why this has to look more similar than the other. And that kind of explanation is much more, interesting. And once you understand this motivation of why I'm interested in quantum cognition at the high level, then you probably start to also become motivated and then also get to sort of the bottom of the quantum cognition and then come back, right? And then we need some kind of several iteration. And I think similar thing can happen in the category theory, but today let's not extend too much about it. Oh, we can actually talk about it, and then maybe we can continue this discussion now next week. Anyway.
Yeah, this is extremely fascinating. I have a few quick questions to you. So these things that get violated, is that basically, couldn't you just say that, well, any non-Euclidean geometry doesn't have to follow these axioms, right? So it could still be a point in a multidimensional space. It's just non-Euclidean. Would that still work?
Yeah, so that's potentially, true. These distance axioms can be actually also relaxed in various ways. And if you type, metric axiom or something on YouTube, then there is a list of the things that you can actually relax each of them, like a triangular inequality or symmetry violation is also removed, or minimality assumption is also removed, and things like that. And that makes me also interesting to think about IIT's axiom as well, right? Now it has 5 sets of axioms. But I imagine that there will be some kind of future attempts to relax or replace one of the axioms, and then to see what follows. And in many cases, this relaxation of the distance axioms find some kind of application. It's interesting, right? Like in the case of the energy, like from the position A to position B, going from A to B and B to A doesn't necessarily need to be the same kind of energy consumption because of the height. So this kind of thing requires different kind of ideas than the standard measure of the distance. But even with that, minimality assumption, for example, has to be satisfied, right? Like to get zero energy, you can't move. And also, this triangle inequality also has to serve, right? Maybe not, if there is some kind of, way that is actually like a shortcut to get from A to C, then, but that itself could be the minimum, distance. I don't know. I have to think about it. But, there are lots of ways to relax actions. And I think this, Lee's paper is actually interesting in that way. But most of the models that the philosophers or psychologists have thought about, I think, is pretty much like points in high dimensional space, which in my mind, it has lots of problems.
You made that point before that I found really interesting, how we can have conflicting beliefs and cognitive dissonance, right? So that would also be, that's more like Schrödinger's cat, that you're alive and dead at the same time, right? So that's also hard to understand maybe in a classic Euclidean space, how two conflicting mindsets can coexist basically simultaneously, right? So that's another example where it seems that a simple geometric description doesn't seem to suffice.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is this kind of figure, right? Impossible figure.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I always think that this is not impossible at all, but it's also interesting kind of idea that comes more close to category theory, in fact, in my mind. So here, there is this interesting kind of idea called sheaf or pre-sheaf theory. And that's the next paper that we are trying to write. But the upshot of this is that there is a possibility to construct a sort of logical space or, argument, or in a sense, the form of the reality where the truth statement acts locally. It doesn't have, the truth has to be always true across the entire world. When you apply, or, it's like, in a sense, conditional probability kind of, idea. Within this region, you follow this, rule, and then within this region, you follow this rule. But the important thing is that, this kind of patch cannot be completely independent. It always has an overlapping kind of area. And then within overlap, it is completely, consistent. But when you see here and then there, it could be completely different. Like a statement of that today, it's sunny, right? It's not probably, considered as something that is possible to assess either true or false. But it is true in my neighborhood, and it is true also within probably Melbourne, but it's not probably true for like, Vanderbilt right now, right? But it doesn't mean that, the statement that, it's sunny today is not meaningless, right? It is, within our language, under this condition, it is true. And this is pretty lawful. And this, sheaf and pre-sheaf gives basically, if you, sort of focus on particular kind of area, let's say, if you look at this particular area, like, if you're paying attention to, this part, it makes sense in itself. And then if you zoom out, and then if you pay more attention around, elephant's head, then it also makes sense because we have a lower resolution in the periphery and so on. So I think this is the kind of thing that I was thinking. So consciousness probably, also has this sheaf pre-sheaf structure, I think.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Can I switch gears really quick? Because I have two big questions. The first one is, we talked about jargon, the difference between the cause effect structure, or CES, versus what you computed the maximal information structure, maximal integrated information structure. So how do you see these two relate? My understanding is that the cause effect structure, the CES, that is what IIT would say. If you could compute that for the entire system, that should be your qualia or your quale. And then the MITCS that you computed, that's basically looking at, you can look at how phi changes as a function of mechanism.
Yeah.
Correct? And so those are related, but how would the MITCS get you to qualia, I guess is my question.
Yeah, so there are, I think you probably understand it, but let's see what I would say. So first of all, this mix is something that we can't compute.
Yes.
Because this is something that we need to compute over all the combinations and then eventually arrive at this maximally, right? That's the sort of the complex, idea of complex. Identification of complex is very difficult kind of program. And there are many different kind of, layers of the different difficulty here. So we can't really talk about mix. And then what we did in this paper, fly paper, is also not to compute the mix.
Oh.
And what we did was that assuming that what we were recording is probably a part of the mix, and then assuming that does it actually change between a wakeful state versus an anesthetized state. So it doesn't actually directly test what IIT is proposing. So in that sense, I think what you are doing is totally fine. That cause effect structure is something that we can locally compute, and then we assume that that local causal effect cause effect structure is something that reflects the part of the consciousness. Like if you, this is my hypothetical situation, but let's say if you record a bunch of the neurons from V4, V8. And then we also get color query kind of characterization through a similarity analysis and things like that. The cause effect structure within was computed from the V4, V8 probably corresponds to color query similarity structure. But it doesn't mean that that is V4, V8 structure explains everything, right?
Got it.
And most likely V4V8 structure is included within this mix. But that's an assumption.
I understand now. That's very clear. Thanks so much. That clears it up a lot. So that's really helpful too, because the criticism of using IIT in this way for data that's clearly just a subset of the whole brain, that goes away with that. We're not striving to get the mix. We can just locally compute the cause effect structure.
Yeah. So in addition, in a sense, here, empirical scientist has to take this, attitude that, you assume that B4B8 is likely to be related to color and so on, right? And so you need to first choose the part of the brain that from other, literature, you are confident that that's definitely part of the complex and so on.
Yeah.
So in that sense, when you are working on the V1 data, then you might need to take a stance that, based on lots of evidence, we believe that V1 should not be a part of the complex. And therefore, it should not also, generate lots of, integrated information. And whatever it changes should not directly relate to consciousness. But maybe other parts of the brain areas are highly correlated with the V1, the cause effect structure. So maybe there is some kind of, relations. But the prediction from IIT is that if we can, compute this mix across all the brain and identify which part of the brain explains our conscious experience right now, then, every part of the thing that participates in experience should contribute to experience. And about the V1, V1 involvement, there are many different kind of, position. And I think Andrew Horn and the Tononi's paper thinks that, it's not easy to dismiss V1 at this stage.
Yes, that's my understanding from talking to him as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, another quick question, maybe since it came up when I gave my talks. So there's this diagram that is in the field of consciousness research around a lot. I think it goes back to Stephen Loris, where you would put arousal on one axis and then content on the other, right? And so at first, that seems to map onto what IIT is saying, with phi going up and down, but content being a separate dimension almost with the mix or the CES. So does this map, does that work, or how do you see that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I have to confess that, I'm taking basically the same kind of approach as this first encounter and second encounter kind of approach. And Steve Loris, picture is good as a sort of, introduction of this complex, concept of consciousness into two things, level and concepts and the contents. But that figure is definitely, misleading. And I think when we wrote this paper with Melanie Body, it was again, I think it was Julio who suggested to replace this figure. So this is a famous figure from Steve Loris, yes. Right? And exactly. Note that, this paper that we wrote, it also has Steve Loris as an author, right? But what Melanie in the end, came up with is this figure, which I think, we should use for the future. And here, the left axis, y-axis is now level or contents of consciousness.
Oh, interesting.
And then the x-axis is the vigilance, which is the awake behavior.
Yeah.
Right. So here we are kind of identifying the level and the contents as the same thing. And then the x-axis is the external behavior. So conscious versus behavior kind of axis here. And that's probably better way to organize all these different kind of things. Like here on the right side, it's quite misleading. I would say that level of consciousness is very high here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like vegetative state, for example.
Yeah,
it's incompatible with what IIT and other PCI is actually already finding. If you take this level of consciousness as subjective level of consciousness.
Yeah.
But from the behavior point of view, indeed they open the eyes and so move a little bit and things like that. So that's kind of high, but level is definitely low from the subjective point of view. And the contents of consciousness is likely to have been very dispersed and feels nothing. And in the sense of the IIT, the big phi, the overall level or quantity of the consciousness, the kinds of the small phi's or informativeness, composition and integration, and those things also diverge, expands a lot. And that's where we are here, right?
That makes sense, yeah. You can't, so because the original axis confused me because it seemed like you could dissociate phi from content, but if you work on the theory, you realize that doesn't work. And so that really makes sense, that one axis is level and content that scales, and the other one is almost behaviorism. Actually,
exactly.
It's actually behavior that mimics consciousness.
Exactly.
But yeah.
So I hope that this paper gets noticed more.
Yeah, I'm glad we talked about that. That makes a lot of sense now. Okay.
But I'm also guilty because I'm using the right side figure for my book as well.
Great, super.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. It cleared up a lot.
All right. So shall we finish for today's session then?
Yes, yes, that was a lot of material, but it was really helpful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'll just stop the
Thank you.
recording for now.